Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with the first lecture of the digestive system, focusing on its general organization and various functions. It also addresses study questions under your course competency number 2. The organs of the digestive tract are already familiar to you. From superior to inferior, they include the oral cavity and all of its contents, including the tongue and the teeth, the salivary glands, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas, the small intestine, the large intestine, including the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon. In humans, there's an S-shaped sigmoid colon, the rectum, and finally the anus. All of that is part of the large intestine. All of those digestive organs can be classified into 2 categories: those that make up the alimentary canal and second, accessory organs outside of the alimentary canal. But these accessory organs are connected to the canal by ducts. The alimentary canal is essentially a muscular tube running from the mouth to the anus with a sphincter muscle at each end. The organs that make up the alimentary canal, therefore, include the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, stomach, and intestines. By the way, the term alimentary refers to nutrition, food, or providing sustenance. So that's where that term comes from. So superiorly, the alimentary canal, or this muscular tube, has a sphincter, which is our mouth, essentially, formed by the orbicularis oris muscle. And then, of course, inferiorly, where the anus is, there's an anal sphincter. The accessory organs mainly assist in digestion, mechanical digestion or chemical digestion. These include the teeth, tongue, gallbladder, salivary glands, liver, and pancreas. So all those organs function together. And again, the functions can be classified into categories. And there's 3 basic categories of function. Either the function will involve secreting some sort of solution or fluid, or the function will involve muscular contraction. In that case, we call it motility. And the third basic function is absorption. That's when nutrients are absorbed across the wall into the body's cells. That involves membrane transport mechanisms. So various parts of the digestive system will perform one or more of these digestive functions. And of course, they have specific names, the functions do, depending on where you are in the body. So the first function that I'll mention is ingestion. That, of course, occurs in the oral cavity, the mouth. This involves some mechanical digestion as well, and motility, because the tongue has to move and we swallow. The second function is propulsion, moving food forward through the alimentary canal. Next, the digestive system needs to chemically and mechanically break down the nutrients that get to the stomach and the intestines. Then the nutrients must be absorbed, so absorption is another function. Those nutrients are absorbed from the lumen of the alimentary canal or digestive tract into the bloodstream. Most absorption occurs in the small intestine. And then finally, waste products or any undigestible material must be eliminated from the body by the large intestine. You may recall that most digestive organs are located within the abdominal pelvic cavity, separated from the thoracic cavity by the diaphragm. But of course, the esophagus is located in the thoracic cavity, and the pharynx in the neck and the head, and the oral cavity is in the head. But most are within the abdominal pelvic cavity. This diagram shows the abdominal pelvic cavity and the membranes that are associated with it. The peritoneal membranes are shown in light blue in this sagittal view of the body. The visceral peritoneum has an arrow pointing to it, surrounds the liver, the stomach, the intestine, that's the large intestine, small intestine. So a visceral peritoneum will always adhere to an organ suspended within the abdominal cavity, whereas the parietal peritoneum lines the abdominal wall, or the abdominal cavity wall. Also note from this diagram that parts of the small intestine, the duodenum here, parts of the large intestine, including the rectum, are actually behind or dorsal to the parietal peritoneum. So we call those retroperitoneal organs, and it's the way that our body develops. You might remember that the kidneys are also retroperitoneal. Now, also shown in this diagram are some yellow structures that are known as mesenteries. Generically, anyway, they're called mesenteries. And what a mesentery is two visceral peritoneal membranes fused together. So first, let's discuss the function before we worry about the structure. The function of a mesentery is to maintain the proper position of organs. It also helps to secure nerves, blood vessels, and lymphatic vessels that supply that organ. And then lastly, you'll find a lot of adipose on mesentery. It functions in lipid storage. Now, concerning the structure of mesenteries, we'll look at this picture. This is a transverse section through the abdominal cavity, and it's showing you the kidneys here. This is musculature dorsally in the back. Here's the spinous process of the vertebrae. So this is the cavity, this gray. And any blue line that's on the wall we would call the parietal peritoneum. And that would be, and that's fine. And then also the blue lines that surround the organs we would call a visceral peritoneum. Notice how a parietal peritoneum, when it leaves the body wall, all of a sudden we call it visceral. That's because they really are connected. It's just their location that distinguishes them from one another. So here, from both the right and the left, we have two peritoneal membranes coming together. They fuse right here at the mesentery. Then they separate and they fuse again more ventrally. So that's also a mesentery. Here are some specific mesenteries that you may have noticed already in your study of digestive organs in lab. So you'll remember the greater omentum that you found in the cat. Here's a picture of it in humans. And that's a ventral mesentery, not that you have to know that, but it is. It extends from the transverse colon. It looks like it has some attachments to the stomach as well, but mainly from the transverse colon, and then it's free on the inferior edge. The lesser omentum extends from the stomach to the liver, keeping those organs in place. And there's a couple of others I've shown here. The small intestine is a small intestine mesentery you found. And then there's a connection between the small intestine mesentery and the large intestine. That's called the mesocolon. That's not in your study question either. Our next topic focuses on the structure of the alimentary canal wall. There are 4 layers that make up the wall of the digestive tract. From the lumen to the superficial surface, these include the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis externa, and then finally, most superficially, the serosa, sometimes called the adventitia. There are specific tissue types in each layer. The mucosa consists largely of epithelial tissue, and it varies from stratified squamous in the oral cavity to simple columnar in the stomach. The mucosa also contains a thin layer of smooth muscle called the muscularis mucosa, just to be confusing. The submucosa consists largely of loose connective tissue. It also contains a network of neurons called the submucosal plexus that neurally connects different regions of the digestive tract. The submucosal plexus here will be part of what we call our enteric nervous system. Enteric refers to the gut. And then the muscularis externa, as its name implies, is composed of smooth muscle, at least 2 layers. In the stomach, we'll see there's 3 layers. It also contains neurons, a plexus of neurons. That plexus is called the mesenteric plexus and is also part of the enteric nervous system. And then the most superficial layer out here, labeled number 4, the serosa, is made up of connective tissue. And on its surface is the visceral peritoneum, which is made up of epithelial tissue. So digestive system functions vary. We have a general scheme for the wall of the alimentary canal. Now we want to look at how different functions of the digestive system can be regulated or controlled. So let's recall the different functions. The different functions would be secretion, motility, and then absorption or digestion of the nutrients. So in this overview of how things are regulated, we're going to consider 2 of those. We're going to consider the function of the digestive system being secretion, making of gastric juice, for example, or the pancreas secreting pancreatic juice. And the second function will be motility, how the smooth muscle contracts to mechanically mix up the food or propel the remnants. So there's different types of stimulation that can affect these functions, these 2 functions. Either a stimulus will be mechanical, like stretch, and that will enhance either secretion or motility. Or perhaps the stimulation will be chemical, like the presence of proteins in the stomach would increase its secretions as well as its contraction. Or the stimulation will be neural. Now then, if it's a nerve that's actually causing an increase or decrease in function, it'll come from the autonomic nervous system or one of those plexuses that make up the enteric nervous system. Lastly, there are also some hormones that play a role in digestive function. So the enteric nervous system will always mediate short reflexes. That means the sensory component and a motor component will be localized. They'll be very close together. So the enteric nervous system includes these 2 plexuses within the wall of the digestive tract, the mesenteric plexus and the submucosal plexus. So the mesenteric plexus, since it's located in the muscularis externa, it will largely stimulate motility or decrease motility. And there are different types of motility depending on where you are in the digestive tract. In the esophagus, we call movement or contraction peristalsis. In the small intestine, we call it segmentation. In the large intestine, we call it mass movement, and we'll go over that later. The other part of the enteric nervous system is the submucosal plexus. And since it is located closer to the lumen, it's going to control the secretions, the glandular secretions, or maybe contraction of the muscularis mucosa. We aren't going to talk about that very much, though, mainly the secretions. So the enteric nervous system could locally control how much gastric juice is produced or how much the stomach contracts. Long-term reflexes involve the autonomic nervous system. Specifically, the central nervous system is going to receive sensory input and send out motor signals via autonomic neurons. So in general, I think you're already aware of the fact that parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system helps digestion, whereas the sympathetic branch does not. So if you think about it, parasympathetic will enhance secretion. It will also increase motility, whereas the sympathetic nervous system will inhibit secretion and decrease motility. One thing to note is the parasympathetic nervous system doesn't always cause muscle contraction. Sometimes, like when we studied the bladder, the parasympathetic nervous system will stimulate relaxation. So there are two sphincters, the pyloric sphincter, and there's a ileocecal valve or sphincter. Those need to relax if you're going to propel food forward in the digestive tract. Here's a picture, kind of a graphical representation of short and long neural reflexes. So this is the lumen of the GI tract or the alimentary canal. And let's say there's a certain chemical present in this lumen. If we follow the blue line, there's a receptor, a chemoreceptor, that detected the presence of that chemical. Well, that could be linked to a neuron in one of those plexuses, the enteric nervous system, and that neuron travels a short distance to affect smooth muscle or a gland in another region of the digestive tract. That's a short reflex. A long reflex could be the same stimulus, a chemical, going to the same chemoreceptor, but this time the chemoreceptor is connected to a neuron, a sensory neuron that travels all the way to the central nervous system via the spinal cord, of course. And then output or motor output is sent via autonomic neurons. Parasympathetic usually travels in the vagus nerve. Sympathetic travels either in sympathetic nerves or splanchnic nerves. So that's a long reflex. So now that you have anatomical knowledge of the digestive system, as well as a basis for understanding its functions, we'll study specific organs within the system. Some organs are adapted for very specific functions, such as chemical digestion, or food storage, or maybe passage of the material, the leftover material. The next slide provides you with a summary of what we're about to explore in terms of digestive system physiology. This is a kind of a detailed diagram that I just recommend you look at for a while, but there's three things to note. Note that chemical digestion occurs predominantly in the small intestine. There's only some carbohydrate that's chemically digested in the oral cavity and some protein chemically digested in the stomach. Also note that absorption occurs predominantly from the small intestine. And lastly, absorbed nutrients might enter the blood or they might enter a lymphatic vessel. We will find out later that only lipids enter a lymphatic vessel before they are sent to the circulatory system. Thank you, and that's all for this lecture.